All right, great. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. And if we could get seated and settled to get through a packed session for today. My name is Victoria Seifert. I'm a director with the Disaster Risk Finance and Parametrics practice at WTW. Very happy to welcome you to today's session, which is co-hosted by Enda Energy, Mercy Corps, WTW on behalf of the Insurance Development Forum, and will focus on the question of from humanitarian response to recovery to reconstruction, a case for risk financing within a loss and damage context. And what we want to do is really look at the types of risk-informed or risk-responsive financing that have the potential to address disaster risk, loss and damage comprehensively across the entirety of the risk spectrum, so before, during, and after an event. And in order to set the stage for that topic, I'm very pleased to introduce Richard Coularton, who is the Vice President of Operations at Tetra Tech. I probably butchered your name, but I'm sure you can correct that, to kick us off with a framing for the overall session, and very much looking forward to that. So over to you.
Thanks, Victoria. You did fine on the name. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Richard Coularton. In addition to being the Vice President of Operations at Tetra Tech, I'm also one of the founding members of the IDF. So it's great to see many old friends. I was asked to sort of set the scene for this discussion, and wanted to share some of the thinking that came out of work I had the opportunity to do this year for USAID's climate adaptation support activity, where we mapped out humanitarian disaster risk financing instruments, 37 of them, and categorized them. Talked with many partners to understand the issues and develop a framework for humanitarian disaster risk finance. And I think some of that work provides an interesting overview for this discussion, and in fact many lessons for the Loss and Damage Fund itself. So can we go to the slides, please? I want to stress four points. So do we have this? Okay, perfect. The first is, and I think everybody here knows this, risk is complicated, and it manifests in complex ways, especially when multiple shocks and stresses are affecting vulnerable households, and particularly risk manifests over time. I think we know that, but in a lot of our work on disaster risk finance, we're focused on getting money at a certain time. And we don't look at the big picture. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things about the set of panels we're going to hear today, is we're talking about different moments along that timeline. What you do before a disaster is important, whether that's land use planning or preparing for an evacuation. What you do during a disaster is important. For example, if you're a farmer and you're facing a failed start of the season, if you have access to another set of short cycle seeds, you can replant and your harvest is not totally lost. So what you do during a disaster matters, and what you do afterwards matters. And that includes both immediately after and in recovery and reconstruction. And I just want to make a point that sometimes the way that risk manifests after a disaster is not intuitive. I think we all know that it's important to get relief assistance to households as quickly as possible. It's 7 times more cost effective than providing late assistance. But I think there are elements of how risk manifests that we don't often think about. So for example, in the Philippines, in the 2 years after a typhoon, 15 times as many children under 5 die as in the event itself. And that's because of reduced household expenditure on healthcare and food quality. 80% of those children are girls. So if we think that after a typhoon you have an immediate life-threatening set of risks for a few weeks, a few months, you're wrong. 2 years is the period that's critical. And so that brings me to the second point. Next slide, please. We have many different opportunities to intervene through that cycle of risk to reduce losses and damages. Adaptation and long-term risk reduction is important, land use planning, infrastructure. What we do right before a hazard, anticipatory action. There's been a ton of innovative work in the humanitarian sector trying to get resources to communities based on early warning before a disaster that can have a significant impact on their ability to weather the immediate impacts. And then, of course, what we do afterwards in terms of the quality of our response, reconstruction and recovery is important. I think one really important conversation at COP is the fact that in many of the most vulnerable places, the only period of time we have to adapt and build climate resilience is between shocks. So thinking about reconstruction and recovery as separate from adaptation is no longer a choice. It has to be part of the story. Next slide, please. As we've worked over the last 10 or 15 years to really innovate around disaster risk finance, to get more particularly prearranged finance in place to support disaster response. Many of you will have read the Center for Disaster Protection's latest assessment showing that only 2% of disaster finance is prearranged. What's emerged is a set of instruments that take advantage of different windows of opportunity, and I think that's really important for us to be much more rigorous about. Those actions we take, short or long term, can take place before a disaster over the long term, right before, during, and after. And what's important here is that, and if you could go to the next slide, the type of disaster risk finance instrument that you use is very much determined by what you're trying to achieve and what window of opportunity you're trying to hit. So, for example, there's a ton of work using parametric insurance, which is very good at releasing money immediately after a hazard has occurred so that you can take advantage of that early action, immediate response window. We use different words for the windows. But if you want to do things in anticipatory action, that tool is much more challenging. Grant finance is typically more effective. Not to say that you can't use a parametric product there, but that tends to be the case. The amount of money you need also determines the type of finance you need and the frequency of it. And so thinking through our architecture for loss and damage finance in the future is really important to be deliberate about those windows of opportunity, the types of action, short and long term, that we have to reduce the risks of disasters through that cycle and take opportunities to advance climate resilience and adaptation. And the types of finance instrument we use are important there. So that's all I wanted to say to start us off those four messages. I hope I made my 7 minutes, Victoria, or less, and I will turn it over to the next panel. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. I'm very impressed with your timekeeping. If I could invite Emmanuel Sek and Gautam Narasimhan on the panel, please, to sit with me. So, as I said, I'm joined by Emmanuel Sek, Executive Director of Enda Energy and based in Senegal, also member of multiple expert groups around loss and damage under the UNFCCC, and joined by Gautam Narasimhan, who is UNICEF's global lead for resilience, climate, and energy. And you're both very familiar with disaster risk financing, parametric insurance, coming at it from different angles. We have a humanitarian actor here, and then Emmanuel is someone who's very closely linked to community needs, and national governments and policies. And the aim of this panel here is to really explore, I guess, the benefits, the challenges, and the limits of risk financing, particularly parametric insurance, to support emergency response in complex crisis settings, and to do so in a needs-based and community-sensitive manner. I will turn to my first question, which goes to Emmanuel to set the stage, and if you could do us, I think, the honor of, I guess, explaining a bit how communities are affected by natural hazards, and in what ways you think insurance can help?
Thank you very much, Victoria. Good morning, everyone. We had a chance to work with different framework. Among these, the Convention to Combat Desertification, the Sendai Framework, and also the Climate Change Framework. To say that talking about hazard or climate disaster or risk is a common denominator between these three framework, and we will add the biodiversity one. That means that there is a possibility for us to facilitate the understanding of communities on all these issues that we are dealing with. Because sometimes we deal with this problem separately, and this complicates their life in terms of how they will tackle the issues, particularly when it's come to climate disaster. I would like just to focus short in a climate disaster, because when we are here talking about that, it's mainly because of loss and damage issues, and we had the chance to work on this. The first things that we did is at least facilitate the understanding of climate risk, slow onset event, to be sure that what we are talking is really related to climate change, because all loss and damage are not linked to climate change. This said, after we have made studies at the community level with the coastal communities, because they are suffering from coastal erosion, to see if their problems was really solved by the government or the different partners that are working with the to support in terms of disaster. For example, we have seen that in Saint Louis, in the north of Senegal, the communities have suffered a lot with coastal erosion. And many of them were displaced, but they did not have enough resources to at least recover. But at least the country, the government have helped and some donors. And what we have seen, we have some companies or institutions that are really helping. For example, we have the National Agricultural Insurance, which is working with fishermen and also with farmers organization, at least to provide some insurance premium. But sometimes the product is not well understood. Because what they know in terms of insurance is often car insurance, and their fear, for example, to ask for the insurance at the country level. So there is a need to really enhance the understanding in terms of insurance, for them to take ownership of the different products that the companies is providing to them, because it is not often the case. So we have worked with them in the program that we had in the multi-actors partnership on insurance resilience, at least to facilitate the interaction between those who are providing premium and the communities, particularly the farmer organization, at least to allow them to protect their crop, because during when they end croppings, there is a loss, for example, because they don't have possibility to stock or to transform. They may suffer also from floods or droughts, and to cover that, the insurance is coming to support and enhance the social protection. So we had this institution, I mean the National Insurance, Agricultural Insurance. We have also the African Risk Capacity, which is helping in terms of when a droughts come to the in the communities, to help them to recover.
Thank you so much, and I think it was very rich journey from a slow onset, a sudden onset, community needs which differ across the country, up to sort of or down to microinsurance and meso-insurance products, as well as I think the variety of needs, right, that you described. If we're talking about climate impacts, we talk about implications for displacement, we talk about implications for food security, health security, income when it comes to agricultural productions and crop loss. And also to instruments such as social protection schemes and using those for cash transfer. So it's quite a myriad, I guess, of needs that different communities face. And in addition to the perspective that you provided on the microinsurance, And what I would like to do is to hear from Gautam. Gautam, with UNICEF, you have taken out, or you've tested, I guess, UNICEF's first parametric child-sensitive cyclone insurance product for almost a year now. And it would be good to hear how the insurance payouts, I guess, are supporting the emergency response of your country offices in country, and how and whether it allows you to respond to specific community needs given the context specificity that we heard from Emmanuel as well.
Victoria, thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody, for having UNICEF be part of this. Just to, as Victoria was explaining, just a little bit of the context here. So I'm with UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund. We have an operating presence in 190 countries, including program efforts in 156 countries. And as an organization, we're about 50% on emergency humanitarian and 50% on longer-term development. So trying to find solutions that allow us to better serve communities before, during, and after emergencies is sort of a key area is a key interest for us. Just what Victoria was speaking about. So about a year ago, UNICEF launched its first parametric insurance product. And just the first part of it, and I think picking up a little bit from what Emmanuel was saying, is there was, for us to be able to get it launched, there was a strong period of, let's say, capacity building, partly within the communities that we serve, but very much within our own organization as well. Because there's still often a perspective of, the humanitarian world and the development world are separate and never shall the twain meet. And there's also a perspective of, well, I hope we can speak freely in this audience here. Well, it's like, well, we have to be careful about private sector and risk transfer of insurance because, they're all a bunch of money-grubbing capitalists. And so you have to make sure, is this really going to be money well spent, or is this going to be money that's going to be, just serve capital markets? And kind of related to that, and then you have accountants involved who say, there's no way that this would ever make sense because the insurance companies wouldn't do this if they were going to be paying out more than you were going to be paying in. So how is it ever going to be a good value for money? So there's a long period of well, not too long, but a period of also capacity building within the development community about being able to communicate the value of reducing risk. Because for us, this is what this product is. Just to set it out, I mean, essentially the way it works is that there is a sum of money that is raised, half of it, and the geographic location is 8 countries across 4 cyclone basins. So East Pacific Islands, South Asia, East Africa, and Caribbean Basin. One of the advantages of UNICEF is that since we work globally, you can spread the risk globally. Half of the money goes towards disaster risk reduction and resilience building actions today, focused on water, health, education, and nutrition, and a portion of it for being able to do scenario planning for the 50% that goes towards, which went towards a parametric insurance product on a predetermined trigger that pays out in the event of a cyclone over a certain frequency, trigger, and also calibrated towards the number of children that will be affected. So that was a trigger that was developed. Now that's out of the way, where we found it very useful, again, building from the first part, is the confidence of knowing when and how much money will be released. Because traditionally the way you do it, cyclone hits, you raise a humanitarian appeal, you hope very much that it's going to be in one of the countries that hasn't been forsaken by donors or where there is a donor who has a past interest in being able to fund it. You look at how much money you have weeks down in advance, and then you kind of work your way down the chain. But with this, the advantage of it is that you can do scenario planning in terms of how much money will be released and how quickly it will be released, and you can plan around that. Because to answer, I think, what your question was, Victoria, in terms of what we actually do with the money, there's a portion of the money that, very frankly, was what we've always been done. I mean, if you talk to our country office in Madagascar, it's not like they say, oh, before parametric insurance came along, we had no idea what to do in the event of a cyclone. We ran around like, yeah. But no, I mean, we have contingency plans. We know what to do, but this allows us the ability to plan and be able to execute quickly because we know money will show up. But the other value that we've found for UNICEF anyway is that it allows us a little bit to stretch the boundaries of what humanitarian financing can traditionally be used for. we sometimes have donors that say you have to spend the money in a year, it can't be used for quote-unquote development, etc. But this, since it is event-based and is not necessarily based on, since it's event-based, has some of the shackles there are released. That being said, it's not the answer to everything. I mean, I think you laid out really well the sort of the risk continuum here. And we found it very useful for for immediate response, and also for stretching into that band of building back better. I mean, there's, for example, just picking up on Mozambique as well, when UNICEF and its partners, when you build cyclone-resistant schools, none of those schools were destroyed during Cyclone Freddy. And having some of this financing allows you to be able to do that in the aftermath as part of recovery, rather than having these longer-term cycles. But that being said, is this going to be the answer for the longer-term work of the education system? Probably not.
Thank you. Gautam, I want to pick up on a few points that both of you made, because I think they have implications for how we think about, I guess, the insurance design and the coverage in particular, right? So I think one big learning for us as Willis was also the importance of flexibility when it comes to resources and how you use the payouts. You can use them in a way that responds to particular community needs on the ground. And I think that is one important takeaway. The other bit that I would sort of combine from what Emmanuel has been saying, what you have been saying, Gautam, is that community engagement, community capacity building, awareness raising around what insurance can and cannot do, what the needs are in emergency context, is really important to inform contingency planning, which in turn is supposed to inform, the kind of measures you would want or see feasible to be financed through insurance payouts. As you say, it's not everything. Why it should be priority measures. They need to be sequenced, and then again balanced, I guess, with and that is an interesting consideration, balanced with some kind of buffer for flexibility when it comes to unexpected or unforeseen, I guess, impacts. And as I said, I think also recognizing that insurance can't do all, right? There is an importance of risk reduction, think about reconstruction, building forward better, and recognizing, again, sort of what should factor into the insurance considerations and what should really be parked or fundraised through other resources. And I think, Emmanuel, that also speaks to some of the points that you have been making about the complexity of community needs. What other types of tools and actions beyond, let's say, what can be linked to insurance do you think is important to make communities more resilient in the context of disaster risk and loss and damage?
I don't know how many people have experience in terms of insurance with communities, but I may say it is not easy because these people need to be well prepared, more organized. I think in Senegal we have the chance to have a federation of farmers, to have a federation of fishermen that consolidate or give them strengths at least to deal with the national company on insurance. And also they are even part of this company to deal with the agricultural bank, because if they are not well organized, it will be difficult individually for them to go for insurance. So this is the first things. And the other things is to change people's mind. I have said it, they know more car insurance than agricultural or index insurance. They even don't understand what is climate risk. So we need to inform better on these issues. And then there are many offers, but if you look at the offer, for example, in terms of agricultural insurance, sometimes with the market gardenings, on the market gardening issues, they had difficulties to understand when they will be paid, why they are paying without having return in terms of premium. All these things is really complex for them, but we are working with this institution, and we start working also with the African risk capacity to really calibrate the offer that they are giving to communities in terms of insurance, but for them also to prospect, for example, the digital. I think the technologies are well spread at the national level, and using it to inform an insurance offer is often will be, I think, really relevant. We had the possibilities and a chance also to work with some institution to look at the possibilities when there is some crops to create some cereal banks. And from the resources that they got with these cereal banks, they pay the insurance, because sometimes the income is very low for these communities to at least pay for the insurance. So there is an opportunity when we were talking about, for example, loss and damage, because I'm more focused on these issues, to see how really we reorganize the process in terms of insurance. Because we can say that we are also in the negotiation process. And when we say insurance with the negotiator, then really don't understand or don't want to understand about insurance, because they say, why I will pay insurance for a disaster that affected my community and I was not responsible. For many countries who are negotiating here, if there is an insurance to be paid or a reparation to be done, it should be done by those who had the historical responsibility. So all these things need to be really discussed for people to take ownership of the process that we are doing. It's not just coming and say, for the disaster you are suffering, you have to pay. They can say, no, you don't have to pay. But if, as they are in the front line and the first respondent, sometimes they are obliged to do so. But we need to consider that in this negotiation, also those who are the historical responsibilities have to support the communities.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And I think that is a topic that convenes all of us, and we'll hear more about as well in the second part of the session. I want to pick up on a few points and then sort of link it and hand it over to Gautam as well. I think, for one, the points that you are making, right, around community engagement, really sort of explaining, I guess, or trying to better bring across the value proposition of insurance to build local and regional risk markets together with the African risk capacity, but also within in country is an important one when we think about how to combine, I guess, different types of risk financing, where we have some risk ownership, I guess, at the household level, some risk ownership at the municipality level, some at the government and national level, and then depending on, whether the government invites, humanitarian organizations to support, also the support through humanitarian organizations. But thinking about that spectrum when it comes to the response end comprehensively. And then again, as you said, as part of the awareness building, the contingency planning, also thinking about how to integrate this more broadly with development, risk reduction, reconstruction, and financing for that in a broader adaptation context, and call it that.
Thanks, Victoria. And it speaks a little bit to what we try and do as an organization, which is try and be able to serve communities before, during, and after disasters. And it's the point that you made. I was speaking a little bit about the we shouldn't say challenge, the opportunity there was for internal capacity building inside development organizations. Funnily enough, one of our strongest proponents through this have been people have been our professionals who work on our health sector. And UNICEF has one of the larger health programs in the world. And the argument very, very much is a parallel argument for investing in primary health care, because prevention is resilience. So that's a key part of this product. And going forward, I was very struck by what you said, and that's the tragedy of it. It's less than 2% of disaster risk finance is for prearranged finance. Well, I'm going to kind of abuse the mic and turn it back to you also a little bit. I know I have 2 minutes, but you have 2 minutes then, of where the insurance industry is also going. Because it seems like it would be such a logical way to have greater financing upfront to reduce the losses that are incurred as a result from insurance. But that's not yet what we see. We don't yet see the parallel here of where, to pick up your example of car insurance, if you take a defensive driving course and you put in a car alarm, your premiums are lower. But it would be lovely to see that's where things to go. And one final note, because the danger sometimes...
Thank you. I'm always very happy to have you on our panels. And we recently had a meeting with Gautam and Mark Pash, our boss, who was here, came to me afterwards and said, I really like Gautam's questions. They were very, very challenging and made us think. We could have an entire panel, I think, on where the risk industry is going with this. I think one important point that we certainly recognize is the need to, I guess, if we want to maintain the value proposition of insurance, parametric risk financing, we need to make sure that we invest and mobilize more capital, more funding for risk reduction. There is a question mark, I guess, or there is a lot more to be done on figuring out how to do that, and how to do that sensibly. One of the challenges that we sort of also witnessed with working with UNICEF, and also when we worked together a few years ago, is there is a lot of attention right on the louder side of disasters, which is the immediate impact. There is less attention on the silent side when it comes to preparedness, when it comes to risk reduction and reconstruction, right? And combined, if you think about building forward better, that is pretty much the same thing in terms of implementation and understanding, I guess, the types of financing and funding that one could think of in this context beyond insurance, while using insurance tools when it comes to triggers, is something that Debbie will take up in her part of the panel. I thank you very much, Emmanuel and Gautam. I know you're really, really busy, so I appreciate you making the time and for the rich conversation. And yeah.
Thank you very much. Sani, do you want to come up? Great. So next slide, please. Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie Hillier. I work at Mercy Corps on behalf of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. The first half of this session was about response, and the second half now is about how we can finance recovery and reconstruction. So stand here. I can't see the screen. I'm going to stand over here. So for my bit, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to introduce Sani from UNDP, who's going to talk about his work with governments on the recovery and reconstruction side. And then we should have Swenya from Marsh McLennan, but unfortunately, she had to leave COP last night unexpectedly. So, but it's okay. We have a little video from her for her bit of this session. Next slide, please. So it's been really interesting, this first session, and I'm really pleased that Richard has pulled out the sort of recovery piece, and also Gautam as well. Because often my sense is that in disaster risk financing, sometimes the recovery and reconstruction piece gets a little bit forgotten. There's a lot of focus on anticipatory action, on response, and that's absolutely right. But somehow the recovery side doesn't get quite so much airtime, at least in the circles that I've been in. And yet recovery is obviously by far the biggest financial portion of any kind of disaster financing. So there are no agreed figures on how much loss and damage costs, but if it's something like 300 to 500 billion, then that's an order of magnitude higher than response costs. So this is the big money piece is the recovery and reconstruction. And then there are major economic incentives for making sure that recovery is indeed resilient. So there's a couple of stats here on the screen from GFDRR and from Stefan Halgatz and friends that really show that if the recovery is done in a stronger, faster, and more inclusive way, then there are huge economic incentives for that. So it feels to me like there's a piece here that we're not quite grasping. Next slide, please. Next slide again. So why is recovery kind of falling a little bit through the cracks? We know that recovery and reconstruction is indeed a part of all the big global policy frameworks. So in DRR, it's clearly in the Sendai framework, in Priority 4, but much of DRR emphasis really is focused on the ex-ante side, not really the ex-post. And we see that in practice in the Sendai midterm review, which found that there were some big missed opportunities on the recovery and reconstruction side. It's there, but it's not really a focus. Next slide. And the same a bit with humanitarian and development. Again, on the humanitarian side, there is an early recovery cluster in the humanitarian response system, but it's kind of systematically underfunded and overlooked. It's never, again, really a priority. And that transition then to development funding often is very patchy, not very smooth. There's an opportunity for more coherence there. Next slide. And then on climate, obviously recovery is not part of mitigation. It's not really seen as part of adaptation. I think finally we're starting to see a space for recovery and reconstruction in the loss and damage discussions. So while recovery and reconstruction is a part of all of these, it's a priority in none. And so that's why I wanted to really talk about it today and give it some focus. Next slide, please. Because we know, and this has come up a little bit already, that it can be genuinely transformational if recovery is done well. And the need to rebuild physical infrastructure provides an opportunity and a space to reimagine development. At the household level, it's critical to restore the income and assets of people very quickly to prevent them falling into poverty traps. And then for countries that have a lot of disasters frequently, the rapid rebuilding process is so important. Next slide. Next slide. So what's the difference then between no recovery and a resilient recovery? I think if we can manage to build in climate hazards, really looking to the future, rather than just building to current disaster standards, again, that's what we're really looking to do, making sure that we are future-proofing recovery. Next slide. And this is how we are looking at recovery. So there needs to be three parts of this. So risk-informed, if we're trying to ensure that communities are prepared for the future, we need to know what the future is. And again, that's around ensuring climate hazards are very well understood and a multi-hazard scope. Recovery needs to be multidimensional. We often talk a lot about physical infrastructure, and there's obvious reasons for that. It's very important. But recovery is much more than physical infrastructure. It's around social cohesion, it's around mental health. There are all kinds of aspects to it which sometimes get forgotten. And again, we need to make sure that those aspects are included. And recovery needs to be inclusive, so recognizing the needs of all vulnerable groups. Next slide. So then, on to the financing part. It's really challenging. I think everyone understands that this is a real problem, that at the national level, there are very few resources for recovery, and what resources that are there are often used for response. So there's a limited patchwork of funding that's available. And because there's very little prearranged, as Richard and others have said, there's very little prearranged financing, which means that countries are unable to plan. Again, as Gautam pointed out, if you know the funding is coming, you can plan ahead and you can make sure things are structured and organized. At the international level, very little grant funding for recovery. Only around 500 million of official development assistance in 2020 was allocated to reconstruction, relief and rehabilitation. And this is such a small amount of money compared to humanitarian response and negligible compared to the recovery needs. So the result is this is almost entirely loans, which of course increases debt burdens, limits development and reduces public services. And as Emmanuel pointed out, this is really not reflecting climate justice or the UNFCCC principle of CBDR. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show this top quote because this is one of my favorite quotes from Ghana's finance minister, actually at COP last year. Because if we have these massive financial gaps, then what is happening? Who is actually paying for this? Who is absorbing the costs? And of course, it's communities. It's economies, it's business, and it's communities. And both countries and households are getting into debt because of this lack of funding. Next slide. So what are the solutions? I've laid out all the problems. Where do we go from here? So again, this issue of pre-arranging financing is so important because it enables things to start quickly and enables the recovery to begin kind of in parallel with the response and make sure there's no gap between the two. There's an example here, and this is just a typical one, but this is an example from Cyclone Idai that hit Mozambique. The time from the cyclone hitting to actually countries getting the reconstruction funding is measured in years, not months. And this really is not a sustainable way forward. So countries' disaster risk financing strategies need to include funding mechanisms for recovery, explicitly building in this criteria for more resilient recovery. And donors and funding institutions can help to incentivize that and provide technical assistance. So there could be, for those of you who know all about CAT DDOs, there could be some prior actions in there around using, making sure that recovery is resilient. and then ultimately more grant finance. And we're hopeful that the Loss and Damage Fund will help to provide some support in that area. So that's an introduction from me. I'd now like to turn to Sani, who, as I said, is from UNDP, and can tell us a little about his experience of how different countries have financed recovery. So Sani, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Debbie and the organizers, for inviting me here. I like your final statement about what's next with the decision on the loss and damage, and I hope the experiences that I'm sharing with you can guide parties who are here and different UN agencies and organizations to think about what's next on loss and damage. As David said, I have a lot of experiences with disaster recovery in the Asia-Pacific region. It's one of the most disaster-prone countries. But I'll start with aligning with the comments that you have made by also maybe quoting Professor Salimul Haq, if he's here. What's next? And I recall when people talk about cost of recovery, there are gaps in understanding gaps in financial recovery. One gap that Salim Bhai would say is that you have to look at not just economic losses, but also non-economic losses. Some time ago, I think he said that Professor Salim Haq said, in one cyclone that he visited, maybe in Kutubia or Hatia districts or areas, islands in Bangladesh, many women, after the cyclone, had suffered from reproductive health issues, miscarriages. And typically, this kind of what is referred to as non-economic loss and damage doesn't capture this type of work. There was an example given by Richard about Typhoon Hayang, and I was also advisor to the Office of the President there for recovery rehabilitation. Indeed, many of the deaths happened even after recovery is being implemented. When I started my career, it was the Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines in 1991. It was, until now, the largest mass people evacuation that follows a natural hazard, such as the volcanic eruption. Over 3 million people were evacuated. Very good early warning system, reduced the fatalities. But actually, the most fatalities happen in evacuation shelters. Especially indigenous population. We call them Aitas in the Philippines. They were mixed with urban population, and they have different health capacities and predisposing factors that majority of those who were killed 12 months or 24 months later on are actually those who have these predisposing factors such as lack of immunity. So this is where I think, gaps in recovery become more important for everyone here, especially within the context of the loss and damage agenda. Equity and climate justice, leave no one behind, become more prominent. And certainly, my key message is that more needs to be done on this aspect. And certainly, financing the loss and damage fund and the funding arrangement ought to address those inequality and climate justice issues. Now, where are we in terms of where we can build upon the notion of climate justice into recovery? At the moment, the dominant approach had been use the post-disaster needs assessment, prepare a disaster recovery framework. UNDP is lead on that. I have been involved in PDNA since 2007 when it all started in Central Java. And there have been 70 PDNAs all over the world since 2014. It is comprehensive. It captures sectoral impacts, almost 18 impacts. And then this becomes the disaster recovery framework. And I think we should continue to work on that because the last one in Turkey earthquake, I was reading and reviewing it. I was one of the peer reviewers. This is the best way to incorporate Build Back Better principles. And if you happen to read the Turkey earthquake PDNA, It has very good 5 elements of how to incorporate, build back better into recovery. So that's the sector of recovery. But I go back to my first point that the gaps appear to be financing community recovery, and you mentioned that also. That is what also Salim was saying. Financing community recovery goes beyond just the sector of recovery. It's about, obviously, livelihood, shelter, but more importantly for us, mental health, reproductive health, of course, social cohesion issues, and for UNDP, human security. When I got involved in Banda Aceh or Aceh Nias tsunami recovery, it's a $7.5 billion recovery, one of the largest in Asia Pacific. I was actually hired to support that. It was tremendous success, very good transformational results with women being awarded the ability to have their names on the title of the land titles. It's very transformative. UN Women, UNICEF, and different agencies were advocates of that. That's transformational. However, having said that though, when SIDA, I think, did a study 4 years later on, 60 or 70% of the people in Banda Aceh are still suffering from depression. They're still suffering from human insecurity. They're still fearful of what would happen next. So that is where, the importance of, again, looking at financing recovery becomes more comprehensive. I think the last point to look at, and I'll be happy to answer questions later on, is the typology of risk. To what kind of risk, especially now climate risk, should we be worried about? One, of course, is that the international community, including the insurance, looks at financing of intensive risk. The catastrophic events in known hotspots, the big monsoon flood, the big earthquake, the big typhoon, and they are actually getting more frequent. I'm helping typhoon Vanuatu, for example, who suffered from 2 big Category 5 cyclones in 1 month during this cyclone season. So these are intensive risks that continue to happen more frequent. But also extensive risks. Extensive risks are important in the context of recovery because they are actually non-catastrophic, but they happen regularly, like landslides and floods. And when you accumulate them over a 12-month period or a monsoon period, they're actually extensive, And it adds to another 40% when we're doing this analysis, and add to another 40% of losses to households. So this is where the risk financing becomes relevant. Most risk financing at the moment supports the big catastrophic event. But with the climate change and regimes of 1.5, 2 degree and 3 degrees Celsius, we see more and more extensive risk. So I think these are counterfactuals that we have to look at when we think about risk financing. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for that. I now want to bring in Swenya. So as I said, she's not here, sadly, but she sent us a video. And I hope that this will answer a little bit Gautam's point around what is the insurance industry doing around risk reduction. I think many of us would agree that this is a little bit of a gap. I think there have been some movements, but there still feels like there's a way to go. So could I ask you to show the video, please?
Hello, thank you for the session, and I'm sorry to not be here in person, but I wanted to share a few quick reflections after basically, the first half of COP, where I think there has been much more focus on the role of insurance here. I mean, just as an example, you don't really have to explain what insurance is or why insurance is part of the conversation here at COP. It's a focus of how can insurance be used as a tool, and maybe not just insurance, but disaster risk finance in general. And let's face it, the standard business model and approach to disaster risk finance has been successful and is strong, but it also needs to be revisited, particularly in terms of how it can support adaptation to changing risks, because that is the reality. I mean, climate change is already having an impact, and we know the direction of travel, and we need to revisit how tools such as insurance can actually become really powerful levers in creating resilience and adaptation. Earlier this year, at Marsh McLennan, we published a report called Staying Above Water. And one of the focus areas was a resilient-focused insurance approach. Well, what does that actually mean? I usually explain it as follows. The objective should really be building capacity for adaptation and adapting communities, businesses, individuals to changing risk levels. This is really important in terms of not just using insurance as a quick short-term fix, but as a tool to create longer-term outcomes. And I think in many parts of the world, insurance is not available, or insurance is not affordable, or insurance is actually not really suitable to deal with changing risk levels. So a key focus is, how can we change that, and how can we start hardwiring adaptation into the business model? Here at COP, my colleagues from across Marsh McLennan launched a report sort of coming up with recommendations of what that actually means, sort of integrating adaptation in the business model. And one particular point there is kind of a call for building back better and integrating resilience into a standard insurance approach. And, the whole idea is using that moment of disaster where a payout comes to then turn that into an opportunity to build resilience. And in reality, we don't do that. There are a few examples, and Flood Re in the UK is one. More and more insurers also here at COP have committed to deliver this sort of resilient reinstatement. But the reality looks different. And I'm very pleased to see that there's more focus on this here at COP, more commitments, also from my own firm, where that notion of risk levels are changing. So if there is a disaster, a loss event, we need to reflect on how we can help people not just to recover, but also to increase their adaptation levels and build their, help them to actually strive going forward. So that is not only something that insurers can do, but in many parts of the world, particularly in most vulnerable countries, there's also a huge role that donors and the international financial institutions can play. And I guess what we see there is, in my mind, too little focus on this notion of using recovery in order to increase longer-term resilience. And together with the Flood Resilience Alliance, colleagues there have actually come up with a really strong case of evidence and examples to actually support this notion of preparedness for recovery. And, there are a couple of suggestions. One is that, for example, CAT DDOs should actually really incorporate and embrace this notion of building preparedness for recovery. And also more funding, more grant funding going into resilient recovery. Recovery is hard, needs to be done quick, but it also needs to be done smartly. And I think this is really the underlying challenge. We know that we will, in many parts of the world, will see a significant increase in extreme events, in losses. And how can we, build financial capacity to respond quickly, but also use that to really support where it's possible, to support, adaptation. And I think that's really where the focus should be. So I really welcome the discussion here, but, it is a journey and it requires shifts in our business models and approaches. But I think here at COP, I've been encouraged. There have been a lot of good discussions, and I think hopefully we can take that home and implement those recommendations and suggestions. So thank you for that. And again, apologies for not being there in person, but I hope you have a good discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we just have a few minutes left. So I'd really like to open up for a bit of Q&A. Feel free to ask questions to Richard and Gautam as well, and all of us. So, yes. Hang on, we need one of these.
Hello, my name is Alexander. I have actually two questions. One of them relates to the first presentation. I mean, if we're talking about the situation when we're adding conflict to the, let's say, DRR issues, how do you think is the framework that you offered also could be applicable to the situation? If yes, then maybe some adjustments should be added to this framework. And maybe the second question, because our team is working for climate insurance products for the communities in Europe, and we're facing already some challenges with communicating with the communities. Maybe somebody from the panel could also share their experience in, let's say, barriers and how to overcome the barriers in like communicating and promoting those insurance products, climate insurance products for the communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much. My name is Kennedy Ododa from Kenya, working for Adaptation Consortium. Maybe the panelists can help me understand the aspect of inclusivity. How do we break that barrier in terms of the cultural, the context-based issues?
Thank you for the panelists. Thank you very much. So I came here this morning because I read an article from Simon Young from WTW this morning, who is, okay, so I read your article this morning, was actually highlighting the same thing the colleague from you said, the importance of reducing vulnerabilities and exposures and on the adaptation efforts on that. I'm not a risk finance person, but rather like a finance person, sustainable finance person. So I'm not very, maybe my question will be naive. So I understand that pricing, for example, on parametric insurance will come after considering, for example, the risk ownership structure, right? And then scenarios which are there, and then also considering what effort should be made on adaptation. So it's a difficult thing to price for communities. Is there a risk of mispricing or asymmetry in pricing parametric insurances? So it's more like a finance question on asymmetric in pricing and fair pricing. Thank you.
Richard, do you want to take one or as many of those questions as you like? I'm sorry that I don't think we can take any more questions because we're running out of time.
Sure.
And fairly quickly, Richard, if you could. Thank you.
Conflict. I mean, I think it's a great question, and the answer is yes. It's obviously complicated, but there are few conflict situations where you don't also have climate and other risks at play. So I think that's one really important thing. So, for example, in Ukraine, right now, as we go into the land preparation season and the beginning of the agricultural season, what happens in the agricultural season this year is critical. In other conflicts, preparing for winter and winterization and those cycles is critical. So I think understanding how those risks, both the conflict and the natural disaster risks, play out over time and trying to anticipate that is important. And the financing is important too. So you have to recognize that the dynamics of conflict are very complicated and that a parametric insurance product is probably not going to be the right risk financing solution to deal with that. But rapid response funding that can be deployed quickly as the conflict evolves will really help better response. And funding for recovery and reconstruction afterwards that takes into account the risks that will be faced in the future, climate and others, is also critical. And on the inclusivity thing, just one quick thing. In the study that I mentioned, we found that almost all disaster risk finance instruments in the humanitarian community are gender neutral, and that is not acceptable.
Very quickly, because I have to run. Don't want to take away too much time. So in terms of work in Europe, on your question, I think you're raising an interesting point and some points that we're also thinking about in terms of the experience that we have with regards to highlighting the value proposition, if you want to say so, or even awareness raising on climate risk and how that affects communities going forward, how it affects income, balance sheets, is a critical one that we have to have in Europe, and we don't have it enough yet, and awareness is too low, right? If we look at last year, droughts, floodings really sort of picking up, and we have several agricultural communities. I am from Germany, in the German countryside, smaller scale farmers that are struggling, and there is no conversation around this. And we have a similar issue when we look at cities and the risk that cities face, whether it's heat or drought and water scarcity. So I welcome, you working on this, and I'm happy to discuss that further. And then on the point of pricing, and I guess asymmetry in terms of information, the type of information that you need essentially for a parametric product, and Simon is the expert here more than me, is for one, the type of risk you want to cover, how you want to capture that risk when it comes to the metrics you want to use, wind speed, for example, rainfall. We usually aim to keep the modeling of the risk and the hazard as simple as possible. And then the community engagement or the beneficiary or customer engagement really comes in trying to understand what it is that you want to cover with that, what it is that you want to have financed. And that is a journey that really takes time and that many don't take, enough in order to try and sort of preempt information asymmetries, as you have been pointing to beforehand. I'm going to stop here, Debbie, and I have to run. It's really nice seeing all of you, and Simon, if there's any.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining the session today. I think we haven't got as far as any of us would like to, and I guess a challenge out to the insurance industry from Svenja and also Gautam about how can, when we come back next year at COP, how can we make sure that we've collectively moved on in terms of hardwiring resilience into response and recovery. So thank you very much, everyone.